I found out about my grandchild's birthday party the same way you find out about weather you were never meant to experience, by accident and too late to prepare your heart. It was a quiet afternoon, nothing dramatic. I had just finished washing the teacup I always use, the one with the thin crack along the rim that I keep meaning to throw away but never do. I dried my hands slowly, stood near the kitchen window, and glanced at my phone without expectation. There was no message waiting for me. There never is, not anymore. But when I opened my social feed out of habit, there it was. Balloons, a cake, a smiling child with frosting on his cheek, my grandson, turning 6. For a moment, I thought it must be an old photo, something from last year. I enlarged it, then another. Different clothes, different decorations. A caption that read, "Perfect day with the people who matter most." I remember reading that sentence more than once, as if repetition might change its meaning. I didn't feel anger right away. That came later. What I felt first was confusion, an almost childish kind. I searched my memory carefully, the way you do when you think you've misplaced something important. Had I missed a call? A message? Had I misunderstood a date? I checked my calendar, even though I already knew. The day was blank. I sat down slowly, the way you do when your knees have learned patience before you have. My body reacted before my pride could. There was a small tightening in my chest. Not pain exactly, more like the absence of something that had always been there. An assumption, maybe, that I would be included. That birthdays, especially children's birthdays, were shared spaces. That family didn't require an invitation. I had believed that for most of my life. Apparently, I was wrong. I want to say this clearly because it matters. I wasn't angry because I wanted cake or balloons or noise. I'm too old to pretend that's what hurt. What hurt was realizing that the decision to exclude me had been made calmly, quietly, without hesitation. No argument, no explanation, no apology, just omission. And omission, I would later learn, is the cleanest way to erase someone. As I sat there, my mind did what it always does when it senses danger. It began to justify on behalf of others. They must have assumed I was busy. Maybe it was last minute. Perhaps it was small, just immediate family. I was generous in my thinking. I always have been. It's a habit you develop when you spend decades trying to keep peace. But the photos told a different story. There were friends, neighbors, in-laws, people whose names I barely recognized, people who had met my grandson after I had held him as a newborn, after I had rocked him through fevers, after I had driven across town with groceries because his parents were too tired to shop. That was when the realization arrived, not like a blow, but like a quiet sentence spoken in an empty room. I was not forgotten. I was excluded. I didn't cry. That surprises people when I tell them. They expect tears, drama, a breaking point. But grief doesn't always announce itself that way, especially at my age. Sometimes it simply sits beside you, polite and heavy, waiting to see if you'll acknowledge it. I made myself another cup of tea. I carried it carefully to the table. I noticed how steady my hands were. That steadiness felt almost insulting, as if my body had decided this pain wasn't worth reacting to. I thought about calling my son. I even picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over his name, which I still keep saved with a small heart emoji from years ago. I didn't press it, not because I was afraid of what he would say, but because I was afraid of what I would say. I've learned that once words leave your mouth, you don't get to choose how they're remembered. And I wasn't ready to be remembered as the difficult mother, the emotional one, the one who makes things awkward. That label has followed me my whole life like a shadow I didn't cast. Any time I expressed hurt, it was interpreted as demand. Any time I asked a question, it was heard as accusation. So I stayed quiet. I learned to turn pain into patience, disappointment into understanding. I told myself that love meant absorbing things without complaint. that good mothers and good grandmothers do not ask to be chosen. They simply wait to be useful. Looking back now, I see how dangerous that belief was. I spent the rest of that afternoon doing ordinary things, folding laundry, watering the plant near the door, watching the light move across the floor. From the outside, it would have looked like any other day. From the inside, something had shifted. Not shattered, shifted. A small but irreversible movement, like a bone setting itself differently after years of pressure. That evening, my phone buzzed. A message from my son. "Hope you're doing well." Nothing more. No mention of the party, no explanation, no invitation extended too late. Just a sentence that hovered politely, as if nothing had happened. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put the phone face down on the table. It was in that moment, quiet, unobserved, unremarkable, that I began to understand something I had never allowed myself to think before. Being excluded didn't hurt because I needed them, it hurt because I had believed I mattered by default, and that belief, once shaken, leaves you standing in a very different place. I went to bed that night earlier than usual, not because I was tired, but because I didn't trust myself to sit alone with my thoughts any longer. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I replayed years of birthdays I had planned, cakes I had baked, parties I had hosted, without asking whether I wanted to. I remembered staying up late cutting paper decorations, holding crying children, smiling through exhaustion. I had never once thought to ask whether I would be invited in return. That was never the agreement, or so I thought. Sleep eventually came, thin and restless, and just before it did, a question formed. Not angry, not accusing, just honest. When did my presence become optional? I didn't know then that this question would change the way I saw my family, my role, and myself. Only I knew that something had ended quietly that day, and something else, still unnamed, had begun. In the days that followed, the question did not leave me alone. It followed me through the house, sat beside me at meals, lingered in the pauses between ordinary tasks. When did my presence become optional? I tried not to ask it directly. I tried to soften it, to make it smaller, the way I had always done with uncomfortable truths. But it refused to shrink. Instead, it began to open doors in my memory that I had kept carefully closed for years. I started thinking about all the times I had rearranged my life without anyone asking me to. The afternoons I canceled plans because a child needed help. The weekends I spent driving back and forth across town because it was easier for me than for them. The quiet agreements I made with myself. This is what love looks like. This is what good mothers do. I had never questioned those rules. They were stitched into me long before I knew I had a choice. As I moved through my days, I noticed how automatic my habits still were. I would reach for my phone when I saw something I thought my son might like. I would pause in the grocery store, considering what snacks my grandson preferred, before remembering there was no one to buy them for. These small moments felt heavier than the larger realization. They revealed how deeply my sense of usefulness was tied to my sense of belonging. I began to wonder if I had trained my family, without realizing it, to see me not as a person, but as a function, someone who shows up, someone who fills gaps, someone who smooths over difficulties and asks for nothing in return. That role had once felt honorable. Now it felt dangerously invisible. One afternoon, I sat down with an old photo album. I hadn't planned to. It was just there on the shelf, its spine worn soft from years of handling. I opened it slowly, turning pages with care. There were pictures of birthdays I had organized, holidays I had hosted, children laughing in rooms I had cleaned before dawn. In many of the photos, I was not present. I was the one behind the camera. At the time, that absence had felt practical. Now it felt symbolic. I realized then that my exclusion from the party hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of a long, quiet pattern, one where I had made myself easy to overlook. Not intentionally, not consciously, but consistently. I had believed that selflessness would secure my place, that if I gave enough, I would be indispensable. Instead, I had become convenient. This realization didn't make me angry, it made me tired in a way I hadn't felt before. Not the tiredness that sleep cures, but the kind that settles into your bones when you finally see something clearly after years of avoidance. I felt grief for the woman I had been, the one who never thought to protect her own presence, the one who believed that love was proven through endurance. I thought again about calling my son. This time, the hesitation felt different. It wasn't fear, it was discernment. I asked myself what I hoped to gain from the conversation: an apology, an explanation, an invitation retroactively extended. None of those things felt satisfying. What I wanted, I realized, was recognition, and recognition cannot be demanded without changing the relationship entirely. So I stayed silent. Not as punishment, not as strategy, but as observation. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped filling the space automatically, if I didn't remind, if I didn't adjust, if I simply existed without making myself useful. The days passed quietly. No one mentioned the party. No one checked in to see if I had seen the photos. Life continued at its usual pace, which told me more than any conversation could have. My absence had not disrupted anything. That truth stung, but it also clarified. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a different way of being, one where my value was not measured by how much I gave, but by who I was when I wasn't giving at all. The idea felt unfamiliar, almost rebellious. It challenged everything I had been taught about motherhood, sacrifice, and love. But it also felt strangely light, as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had shifted. I began making small changes, not visible ones, not yet, internal ones. I stopped anticipating needs before they were expressed. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head for choices I hadn't even made. I allowed myself to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to resolve it. These were quiet acts, but they required courage. At night, I lay awake thinking about the story I had told myself for decades, that good mothers disappear so their children can thrive, that dignity comes from endurance, that asking to be included is a form of weakness. I saw now how incomplete that story was, how it left no room for the woman behind the role. The exclusion from the birthday party had not broken me. It had exposed something fragile but necessary, a truth I had been circling my entire life without naming: that love without visibility is unsustainable, that relationships without mutual recognition slowly hollow the one who gives most. I didn't know yet what I would do with this understanding. I only knew that I could not unknow it. Something had shifted again, more deeply this time, and as unsettling as it was, it felt like the beginning of honesty, with myself first. The change did not announce itself. There was no decision made at the kitchen table, no vow whispered into the quiet of the evening. Instead, it arrived the way many real changes do, through omission, through the things I did not do, the habits I did not reach for, the reflexes I allowed to fade without explanation. The first thing I noticed was how often my hands were still. Not idle exactly, but unoccupied by the familiar urgency that had guided them for years. I no longer checked my phone first thing in the morning to see if anyone needed something. I let messages sit unanswered for longer than usual, not out of spite, but because I was learning to hear my own thoughts before responding to someone else's needs. This was unfamiliar territory for me. Silence had always felt like negligence. Now it felt like space. At the grocery store, I walked past the aisle where I used to buy my grandson's favorite cereal. My feet slowed there automatically, as if muscle memory were pulling me back. For a moment, I stood staring at the shelves, my mind filling with old calculations. How many boxes would last the week, whether the brand was on sale, whether I should pick up the chocolate version because he liked that one better. Then I realized there was no upcoming visit, no reason to prepare, no expectation attached to my choice. I walked on. The lightness I felt afterward surprised me. It wasn't relief, it was clarity. At home, I began noticing how much of my day had once been shaped by anticipation, anticipating calls, anticipating requests, anticipating disappointment, and adjusting my emotions in advance to soften its impact. Without those anticipations, time stretched differently. Mornings became slower. Afternoons felt longer, less crowded with imagined obligations. I found myself sitting in a chair simply because I wanted to, not because I was waiting to be interrupted. With that space came an unfamiliar discomfort, a quiet restlessness that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with identity. When you spend most of your life being needed, the absence of need can feel like erasure. I had to resist the urge to manufacture usefulness just to reassure myself that I still existed. That urge was strong. It whispered old promises. If you just offer help, you'll be included again. If you remind them you're available, they'll remember you. But I didn't. Not this time. The consequences of that choice were subtle at first. No one noticed immediately. There were no concerned messages asking if I was okay, no sudden invitations extended. Life continued as it had before, which confirmed something I was only beginning to understand. My constant availability had not been the glue holding things together. It had been the cushion preventing others from feeling the weight of their own decisions. I began to see how often I had softened reality for my family, how many small disappointments I had absorbed quietly so they wouldn't have to, how many silences I had filled with understanding so they wouldn't have to explain themselves. By stepping back, I wasn't creating distance, I was allowing the truth to exist unedited. One evening, my son called. His voice was casual, almost cheerful. He asked how I was doing, the way people do when they expect a simple answer. I said I was fine, and I meant it, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped translating my feelings into something more comfortable for him to hear. There was a pause on the line, a small one. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes again. Another pause. Then he changed the subject. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. For the first time, I noticed how quickly conversations moved away from anything that might require reflection, how accustomed we both were to skimming the surface to avoid discomfort. In the past, I would have filled that pause with reassurance, laughter, something to keep the connection smooth. This time, I let the pause stand. It was uncomfortable, but it was honest. As days passed, I became more aware of my body. The tension I used to carry in my shoulders softened. My breathing slowed. I slept more deeply, though my dreams were vivid and unsettled. I dreamed often of rooms I used to clean, tables I used to set, doors I used to open for others. In the dreams, I stood still while the rooms rearranged themselves around me. I woke with a sense of quiet awe, as if my mind were processing something my waking self was only beginning to accept. I started doing small things for myself, things I had once dismissed as unnecessary. I read in the afternoon, without guilt. I took longer walks, not to clear my head, but to listen to it. I noticed details I had rushed past before, the sound of wind against the fence, the way light shifted across the walls as the day changed. These moments didn't make me happier in any dramatic way. They made me present, And presence, I was learning, is a form of strength. There were moments when doubt crept in, moments when I wondered if my quiet withdrawal would be misinterpreted as coldness, if my silence would be taken as punishment. I worried about becoming a story told about me rather than a person known. But I also knew that explaining myself would pull me back into the familiar role of emotional manager, and I was no longer willing to do that. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped me as I was checking the mail. She asked how my family was. I hesitated before answering, not because anything was wrong, but because the question no longer felt simple. I said they were well. She smiled and nodded, satisfied. As she walked away, I realized how often we compress our lives into acceptable answers for the sake of ease, how rarely we are asked or allowed to tell the truth. The truth, for me, was this: I was learning how to exist without performing usefulness, and that learning was changing me. I thought again about the birthday party, the balloons, the cake, the people who had been there. I imagined the laughter, the noise, the ordinary joy of it all, and for the first time, I did not feel the sharp edge of exclusion. I felt distance, not cold distance, but perspective. I could see the event for what it was, a moment in their lives, not a verdict on my worth. This realization did not resolve everything. It did not repair the relationship or rewrite the past, but it altered the direction of my attention. Instead of looking outward, waiting to be acknowledged, I began to look inward, asking different questions. What do I want now? What do I need? What kind of presence do I want to offer? Not out of obligation, but choice. The answers did not come all at once. They arrived slowly, through practice, through restraint, through the courage to let things unfold without intervening. This was not passivity, it was intention. I could feel the consequences of this shift beginning to ripple outward, though no one had named them yet. Conversations felt slightly different. Expectations were subtly rearranging themselves. And beneath it all, something steadier was taking root, a sense of self not defined by invitation or exclusion, but by quiet self-recognition. I didn't know how others would respond to this change. I only knew that I could no longer pretend it hadn't happened. The old patterns were loosening, and whether that would lead to understanding or resistance was something I would soon discover. It didn't take long for the change to be noticed. Not announced, not confronted, noticed. People sense absence long before they understand it. They feel the missing weight before they can name what's gone. And when the absence belongs to someone who has always made themselves available, it creates a quiet unease. The first sign came in the form of a question that sounded harmless enough. My daughter-in-law called one evening, her voice light, almost cheerful. She asked how I'd been. I answered honestly, without elaboration. There was a pause, the same kind I had noticed with my son, a space where something unspoken hovered between us. Then she said, "You've been quiet lately." Not concerned, observant, as if noting a change in weather. I said yes. I didn't explain. Silence followed again, longer this time. I could almost hear her recalibrating, searching for the version of me she was used to, the one who filled gaps, who reassured, who smoothed. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted. "Everything okay?" she asked. The question carried a subtle expectation, a door opening for me to step through and resume my role. I didn't step through it. "I'm fine," I said, gently. And I was, but not in the way she meant. That call ended politely, but it left behind a faint tension I could feel even after the line went dead. It was the tension of unfulfilled expectation, of a pattern interrupted. I sat with that feeling longer than I might have before. I let it exist without rushing to resolve it. And in doing so, I learned something important. Discomfort does not mean something is wrong. Sometimes it simply means something is changing. Other responses came more subtly. Invitations slowed, then shifted in tone. Messages that once assumed my availability began to include phrases like, "if you're free," or "no pressure." These small adjustments spoke volumes. They revealed how deeply my previous certainty, my predictability, had shaped the rhythm of our relationships. Without it, others had to pause, consider, ask. That pause was unfamiliar for all of us. Not everyone responded with discomfort. A friend I'd known for years commented on how peaceful I seemed. "You look rested," she said one afternoon as we sat together. Her observations startled me. I hadn't realized the change was visible, that someone else could see what I was only beginning to understand. She didn't ask questions. She didn't probe. She simply accepted the version of me that showed up that day. That acceptance felt like a small gift. But not all reactions were gentle. One evening, my son called again. This time, his tone was different, less casual, more direct. He asked if I was upset about the birthday party. The question landed between us with surprising weight. I realized then that my silence had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. I took a moment before answering, not to calculate my words, but to feel them. I noticed I wasn't invited. I said, "Nothing more." There was a quick intake of breath on the other end of the line. Then explanation followed, disorganized, defensive, layered with justification. It wasn't intentional. It was last minute. They didn't think I'd want to come. They assumed I was busy. Each sentence was an attempt to protect the image he had of himself as a good son. I listened without interrupting. I recognized the impulse. I had spent years protecting others in the same way. When he finished, there was silence. He waited. For reassurance, for forgiveness, for me to tell him it was okay. I didn't. "I understand," I said finally. And I did. Understanding had never been my problem, but understanding no longer meant erasing myself. That distinction was new, and I could feel it settling into place as I spoke. But it hurt. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter, uncertain. The conversation ended soon after, unresolved but honest. When I hung up, my heart was steady. That surprised me. In the past, speaking honestly had always left me shaken. This time, it left me grounded. I began to see how others reacted differently depending on what they expected from me. Those who were used to my silence found my calm honesty unsettling. Those who valued me as a person, not a resource, adapted easily. This realization was painful but clarifying. It showed me which relationships were built on mutual recognition and which had relied on my quiet endurance. As these interactions accumulated, something within me solidified. I stopped questioning whether I was doing the right thing. I stopped rehearsing apologies for boundaries I hadn't even named out loud. I began trusting the sense of peace that accompanied my choices. That peace was not loud. It didn't announce itself as confidence. It simply remained, steady and unbothered. I noticed, too, how my posture changed, not dramatically, but subtly. I stood straighter. I spoke more slowly. I allowed pauses in conversation without rushing to fill them. These physical changes mirrored an internal one. I was no longer bracing myself against disappointment. I was allowing people to meet me where I was, or not at all. There were moments when guilt tried to return. Old instincts don't disappear quietly. They knock, persistent and familiar. But each time guilt surfaced, I examined it. Was it a sign I had done something wrong, or merely a sign that I was no longer performing a role others had grown comfortable with? The answer, more often than not, was the latter. One afternoon, as I sat alone with a book I had been meaning to read for years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment without justification. I wasn't resting because I had earned it. I wasn't taking time because someone had granted it to me. I was simply living. This was when I realized that self-definition doesn't arrive in grand declarations. It forms quietly through repeated acts of respect, especially self-respect, through the courage to let others adjust, through the willingness to be misunderstood rather than invisible. The reactions around me continued to vary. Some relationships grew awkward, others softened. A few surprised me entirely. But beneath it all, my sense of who I was no longer depended on being invited, included, or needed. It depended on something far more stable, my own recognition of my worth. I didn't know yet how this shift would ultimately reshape my family. I only knew that it had already reshaped me, and that, for the first time in a long while, felt like something I could trust. Acceptance did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, scattered through ordinary moments, the way light enters a room through small cracks before you realize the whole space has changed. I noticed it first in how my body reacted to silence. The silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt neutral, sometimes even kind. I could sit with it without immediately turning inward, without searching for what I might have done wrong. For years, guilt had been my constant companion, not the dramatic kind that announces itself loudly, but the quiet, industrious kind, the guilt that keeps you useful, the guilt that whispers you should, you could, they might need you. It had guided my choices more reliably than desire or rest ever had. Now, as I allowed myself to pause instead of respond, I could feel that guilt weakening, like a muscle no longer being exercised. There were moments when it flared unexpectedly. I would hear my phone buzz and feel a familiar tightening, a reflexive readiness to explain myself. But when I checked, it was rarely urgent. Sometimes it wasn't even for me. In those moments, I felt a strange relief, followed quickly by something close to grief. I was grieving not the loss of connection, but the loss of the role I had played so faithfully for so long. I realized that much of my guilt had been rooted in a belief I had never questioned, that love requires constant proof, that if I wasn't actively doing something for someone, my love would fade from their awareness. This belief had shaped my behavior in countless ways. It had taught me to anticipate rather than respond, to offer rather than wait, to apologize for needs I hadn't yet voiced. Letting go of that belief felt like stepping into unfamiliar terrain without a map. As days turned into weeks, I began to test this new stillness. I declined invitations that didn't feel right, without offering elaborate explanations. I accepted others without rearranging my entire life around them. These choices were small, almost invisible, but they carried weight. Each one felt like a quiet vote cast in favor of my own presence. I noticed how my thoughts changed. I stopped rehearsing conversations that might never happen. I stopped scanning interactions for signs of disappointment. Instead, I began asking myself questions I had never prioritized before. Do I want to go? Do I have the energy? Will this add something to my day or take something from it? These questions felt radical, almost indulgent, but they brought clarity. And with clarity came peace. One afternoon, I stood in the garden behind my house, hands in the soil, feeling the sun warm my back. I had gardened for years, but always with one eye on the clock, one ear tuned for interruption. That day, there was no rush. I stayed longer than planned, letting the work take as long as it took. As I straightened up, I realized I was smiling, not for anyone else, not for a memory or an expectation, but simply because I was content in that moment. That feeling stayed with me long after I went inside. The guilt still surfaced occasionally, but when it did, it no longer commanded obedience. I began to recognize it for what it was, a habit, not a truth, a learned response, not a moral obligation. This distinction changed everything. It allowed me to acknowledge the feeling without being ruled by it. I could say to myself, I feel guilty, without immediately adding, therefore I must fix something. The guilt still surfaced occasionally, but when it did, it no longer commanded obedience. I began to recognize it for what it was, a habit, not a truth, a learned response, not a moral obligation. This distinction changed everything. It allowed me to acknowledge the feeling without being ruled by it. I could say to myself, I feel guilty, without immediately adding, therefore I must fix something. I thought often about the birthday party, but it no longer dominated my thoughts. It had become a reference point rather than a wound, a moment that revealed something important rather than a moment that defined me. I could look at it now with perspective, even compassion, for myself and for my family. I understood that they hadn't excluded me out of cruelty. They had done it out of habit, out of a narrow understanding of roles that I had helped create. This understanding softened something in me. Acceptance does not mean approval. It means seeing clearly without the need to change what you see. I accepted that my children were imperfect, just as I was. I accepted that they might never fully understand the cost of my sacrifices. And most importantly, I accepted that I no longer needed that understanding to live well. With this acceptance came a new kind of freedom, not the loud, celebratory freedom people talk about, but a quiet one, the freedom to choose my pace, to protect my energy, to let relationships find their natural shape rather than forcing them into familiar patterns. This freedom felt fragile at first, like something that could be taken away if I wasn't careful, but over time, it proved resilient. It did not depend on anyone else's behavior. It lived inside me. I began to notice how my presence changed when I stopped carrying guilt into every interaction. I listened more fully. I spoke more directly. I didn't soften my words unnecessarily or hide behind politeness when honesty was required. This didn't make me harsher, it made me clearer. And clarity, I was learning, is a form of kindness to yourself and to others. There were moments of sadness, of course. Letting go of old roles means letting go of familiar rewards. There were times I missed being needed, missed the certainty that came with constant engagement. But even in those moments, I felt something new beneath the sadness, a sense of trust. Trust that I could handle discomfort without losing myself. Trust that my worth did not fluctuate based on how often I was called upon. One evening, as I prepared dinner just for myself, I realized how different the act felt. I cooked what I wanted, when I wanted, without considering anyone else's preferences. I set the table simply, without ceremony. I ate slowly. The meal tasted better than expected, not because the food was exceptional, but because it was unburdened by expectation. I was not serving, I was nourishing. This was the freedom taking shape, not dramatic, not defiant, just honest. I understood then that acceptance was not resignation, it was alignment, an alignment between how I lived and what I valued, between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. The guilt that had once guided me so reliably was losing its authority, replaced by something steadier and more humane. And in that steadiness, I felt ready for what would come next, because acceptance had opened the door to something deeper, not just freedom, but peace that did not need permission. The most surprising thing about boundaries, once I began living inside them, was how little explanation they required. I had always imagined boundaries as something rigid, something you had to defend with reasons and rehearsed justifications. I thought they would invite argument, disappointment, maybe even anger. But what I discovered was quieter than that. Boundaries, when they come from clarity rather than resentment, don't announce themselves. They simply exist. I stopped answering the phone immediately. Not every time, but often enough that my life no longer revolved around the sound of it. I returned calls when I had the energy to listen, not when I felt obligated to prove my availability. At first, I noticed a flicker of anxiety. What if they think I'm upset? What if they need something? But that anxiety faded more quickly each time. In its place grew a calm confidence that I had the right to my own rhythm. Conversations changed. I noticed it most when requests were made. They were phrased differently now, more carefully. There was less assumption in the asking, more awareness. And when I said no, something I had once wrapped in apologies and explanations, I said it plainly. I can't do that today. That doesn't work for me. The words felt strange in my mouth at first, like a language I was still learning, but they didn't feel cruel. They felt accurate. What surprised me most was how rarely those boundaries were challenged. A few times, yes, old patterns don't disappear without resistance. There were sighs, subtle comments, moments of disappointment that hung in the air longer than necessary. But even then, I didn't feel the old urge to smooth things over. I allowed discomfort to pass through the room without rushing to fix it. And it passed. Always. With each boundary honored, my sense of self grew more solid. I no longer felt like I was negotiating my worth in every interaction. I no longer entered conversations braced for disappointment or eager to preempt it. I showed up as I was, without adjusting my shape to fit someone else's expectations. That shift changed how I experienced myself. I felt heavier in the best way, anchored, rooted, real. Peace, I realized, had been something I borrowed for most of my life, borrowed from approval, from usefulness, from harmony that depended on my silence. It was conditional peace, fragile and easily withdrawn. The peace I was beginning to feel now was different. It didn't require permission. It didn't vanish when someone was displeased. It stayed. I noticed it in my mornings. I woke without that familiar sense of urgency, that low-level readiness to respond. I moved through my routine at my own pace, lingering where I wanted to linger. I noticed it in my evenings, too, when I no longer replayed conversations in my head, searching for ways I might have disappointed someone. My thoughts were quieter, not empty, just unburdened. There was one moment that crystallized this change for me. My son asked if I could watch my grandson on short notice. In the past, I would have agreed immediately, regardless of how I felt or what I had planned. This time, I paused. I checked in with myself. I was tired, not exhausted, but aware of my limits. I said no, simply no. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "Okay." No argument, no guilt, just acceptance. When the call ended, I sat there for a moment, stunned, not by his response, but by mine. I felt no remorse, no need to justify, just calm. That was when I understood that my identity had shifted in a fundamental way. I was no longer defined by how much I could give. I was defined by how honestly I could live. That honesty extended not only to others, but to myself. I was no longer betraying my own needs in the name of love. The relationships in my life adjusted accordingly. Some became lighter, more genuine. Others grew more distant, revealing how much they had relied on my flexibility. I grieved those losses quietly, without drama. I understood that not every connection survives growth. Some are built for a version of you that no longer exists. What replaced those connections was not loneliness, but space. Space to think, space to feel, space to notice who I was when I wasn't managing anyone else's emotions. In that space, I discovered parts of myself I had set aside decades ago. Preferences, curiosities, small joys that had seemed impractical when my life revolved around others. I began to trust my own decisions in a way I never had before. I didn't seek validation for my choices. I didn't second-guess myself as often. When doubt arose, I met it with curiosity instead of panic. Why does this feel uncomfortable? What am I afraid of losing? Often, the answer was nothing more than an old fear of being seen as difficult, and that fear no longer held power over me. Peace, when it became permanent, did not feel like happiness. It felt like alignment, like my inner world and outer life were no longer in conflict. I was not constantly adjusting myself to fit expectations that no longer served me. I was standing in my own life, fully. I realized then that boundaries are not walls, they are definitions. They tell the world where you end and where others begin. And once those definitions are clear, you don't have to defend them. They speak for themselves. As I moved through my days with this new steadiness, I felt something else growing alongside it, an awareness of legacy. Not the kind that's written down or spoken about, but the kind that's lived. I began to understand that the way I treated myself now would echo outward, quietly, into the lives of those who watched me. And that understanding prepared me for the next reflection, one deeper, more expansive, about forgiveness, love, and what it truly means to leave something meaningful behind. It was only after things became quieter that I began to think about legacy. Not in the way people usually mean it, not accomplishments or family names or memories captured in photographs, but in the subtler ways a life leaves its imprint, the way patterns repeat, the way silence teaches as much as words, the way children learn what love looks like, not from what we say, but from what we endure without question. For most of my life, I believed my legacy would be measured by how much I gave, how available I was, how reliably I showed up. I assumed that my sacrifices would speak for themselves, that they would translate naturally into gratitude or understanding. But sitting with myself now, without the noise of constant obligation, I began to see that sacrifice, when left unexamined, teaches a dangerous lesson, that love requires erasure. This realization did not arrive with blame, it arrived with sadness, and then slowly with forgiveness. Not forgiveness for my children, but for myself. I thought about the woman I had been when my children were young, how determined she was, how earnest, how afraid of doing something wrong. I remembered the constant pressure to be patient, generous, selfless. I remembered how praise came most readily when I was tired but smiling, stretched thin but agreeable. I had learned quickly which version of myself was celebrated and which was quietly corrected. I had not failed myself intentionally. I had followed the rules as I understood them. That mattered. Self-forgiveness began there, in acknowledging that I had done the best I could with the understanding I had at the time, that I had not chosen invisibility because I believed less, but because I believed love required it. That belief was inherited, reinforced, rarely questioned. Letting go of it did not mean condemning my past self. It meant releasing her from a burden she had carried faithfully for too long. As I practiced this forgiveness, something softened in me. The sharp edges of regret dulled. I stopped replaying moments where I wished I had spoken up, stopped tallying all the times I had stayed silent. Those moments were part of my story, yes, but they were no longer the whole story. They no longer defined me. I began to consider what love looks like when it is no longer measured by sacrifice alone. This was unfamiliar territory. For so long, love had been synonymous with endurance, with showing up no matter the cost, with saying yes even when every part of you whispered no. But what if love could also include presence without depletion? What if it could involve honesty without collapse? What if love did not require disappearing? This question reshaped how I viewed my role, not just as a mother, but as a person in relationship with others. I realized that the version of love I had modeled for my children was incomplete. Not wrong, but incomplete. I had shown them devotion, reliability, care, but I had not shown them boundaries. I had not shown them self-respect. I had not shown them that love can coexist with individuality. That understanding brought with it a quiet grief, not because I believed it was too late, but because I wished I had known sooner. I wished I had understood that the most powerful lessons are often unspoken, lived slowly over time, and that children learn how to treat others by watching how their parents treat themselves. Still, I did not allow that grief to turn into punishment. Self-forgiveness does not work that way. It does not demand perfection retroactively. It asks only for honesty now. So, I began living differently, not to correct the past, but to clarify the present. I allowed my children to see me resting without explanation. I allowed them to see me decline without apology. I allowed them to encounter me as a whole person, sometimes available, sometimes not, always grounded in my own truth. This was not easy. There were moments when old instincts surged back, urging me to smooth things over, to minimize my needs, to retreat into familiarity. But each time I resisted, each time I chose honesty over habit, I felt a quiet strengthening inside me, as if my life were aligning with something deeper than approval. I realized then that legacy is not what you leave behind, it is what continues. It is the emotional language your life teaches others to speak. And for the first time, I felt hopeful about what mine might become. Not because I had done everything right, but because I was finally modeling something new. I was modeling that love does not require exhaustion to be real, that care does not have to come at the expense of selfhood, that saying no can exist alongside deep affection, that presence, when chosen freely, is more meaningful than presence demanded by guilt. In forgiving myself, I made space for something else to emerge, compassion for my children's limitations. I saw how they too were shaped by the patterns they grew up observing, how they learned to rely on my availability without questioning its cost. This did not excuse hurtful behavior, but it contextualized it, and context allowed me to hold firm without becoming bitter. I no longer needed my children to validate my sacrifices. I no longer needed acknowledgement to justify my choices. The meaning of my life did not hinge on being recognized for what I had endured. It rested instead on how I chose to live now, with awareness, with intention, with kindness that included myself. That shift changed the emotional atmosphere of my relationships. I was no longer carrying resentment disguised as generosity. I was no longer giving with the unspoken hope of return. I gave when I wanted to. I withheld when I needed to. And both choices felt equally valid. This, I understood, was love beyond sacrifice. Love that breathes. Love that stands upright. Love that allows everyone involved to remain visible. As this understanding settled into me, I felt something loosening that I had not known was still tight. The need to be remembered a certain way. The need to be seen as endlessly patient, endlessly giving. I did not need to be idealized. I wanted to be real. And in that desire, I sensed the shape of the legacy I was now living into. Not one defined by how much I had given up, but by how honestly I had learned to stay. Time has a way of doing what confrontation never can. It loosens what has been held too tightly. It rounds the sharp edges of old roles until they no longer cut. I began to notice this softening, not through dramatic changes, but through the absence of tension. Things that once felt loaded now felt neutral. Expectations that once pressed heavily against me began to drift, uncertain of where to land. The roles I had inhabited for decades, caretaker, fixer, emotional anchor, did not disappear overnight. They simply lost their urgency. No one announced the change, no one acknowledged it directly. It unfolded quietly, as most real shifts do. I stopped being the first call for every inconvenience. I stopped being the default solution. And the world did not collapse. Life adjusted. At first, this adjustment felt tentative, as if everyone were learning a new language without a guide. There were moments of awkwardness, pauses where someone waited for me to step in, and I did not. Conversations that ended sooner than they used to. Plans that moved forward without my involvement. These moments could have felt like rejection, but they didn't. Not anymore. They felt like redistribution, responsibility returning to where it belonged. What surprised me was how this redistribution changed the emotional tone of my relationships. Without the constant undercurrent of obligation, interactions became lighter. When we spoke, it was because we wanted to, not because we needed something resolved. There was less urgency, less emotional noise. We spoke about ordinary things, weather, work, small joys, without the unspoken weight of expectation hovering over every word. I noticed this most clearly with my grandchildren. When I spent time with them, it felt different now. I was no longer the ever-present background figure, managing logistics and smoothing transitions. I was simply there, attentive but not responsible for everything. I listened more. I laughed more easily. I laughed when I was tired, not when I was depleted. The time we shared felt cleaner, unburdened by the quiet exhaustion that had once followed me home. These changes rippled outward in subtle ways. My children began making decisions without automatically consulting me. At first, I felt a brief sting, an echo of the old fear of being unnecessary, but that feeling passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, relief. Relief that they were capable, relief that I no longer had to carry what was never meant to be mine alone. I realized then that stepping back had not diminished my importance, it had clarified it. I was no longer everywhere, but where I was fully present. That presence carried more weight than constant availability ever had. As weeks turned into months, I noticed how often peace entered conversations without my effort. There were fewer misunderstandings, fewer unspoken resentments. When tension arose, it resolved itself more naturally, without my intervention. I had once believed that harmony depended on my vigilance. Now I saw that harmony grows when everyone is allowed to manage their own emotions. The softening extended inward as well. I was gentler with myself. I no longer criticized my past choices with the same severity. I understood now that I had lived according to the values I was given. That knowledge didn't excuse the cost, but it contextualized it, and context allowed compassion to grow. I began to see my life as a continuum rather than a series of mistakes and corrections. The woman I had been and the woman I was becoming were not enemies. They were chapters in the same story. Each had carried me as far as she could. Each deserved respect. There was one afternoon when this understanding crystallized. I was sitting quietly, watching the light shift across the room, when my phone rang. It was my daughter. She didn't need anything. She just wanted to talk. We spoke for a while, about nothing important and everything meaningful. When the call ended, I felt no fatigue, no sense of having given too much, only warmth. That was when I understood that peace had begun to move beyond me. It was no longer contained within my own boundaries. It was shaping the atmosphere around me, the way I listened, the way I responded, the way I allowed silence without filling it. Others could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. Relationships, I was learning, are living things. They change when one person changes, whether acknowledged or not. By choosing to live more honestly, I had altered the emotional climate of my family, not through force, through example. There were still moments of distance. Some connections remained cautious, as if unsure how to engage with this new version of me. I accepted that. Not every relationship adjusts at the same pace. Some need time, some need space, and some may never fully transform. That too was something I could now hold without resentment. I found comfort in the ordinariness of this stage of life. There was no grand resolution, no dramatic reconciliation, just a steady unfolding, a gradual easing, a sense that I was no longer swimming against the current of my own needs. The peace I felt was not excitement. It was trust. Trust in the rhythms of my life. Trust in my capacity to handle whatever came next without abandoning myself. Trust that my presence, when offered freely, was enough. As I moved through my days, I felt prepared for something else, something quieter but more final, a sense of closure approaching. Not an ending exactly, but a settling, a clarity about who I was, what I would carry forward, and what I could finally lay down. I could feel the story drawing itself toward its final shape, and for the first time, I was not afraid of how it would end. As the years continued to fold themselves into one another, I realized that the moments I had feared losing, the birthdays, the celebrations, the invitations that never came, were never truly about the events themselves. They had been about the recognition, the acknowledgement of my place in the ongoing story of my family. I had assumed that being physically present was the only way to matter, that missing a single event meant erasing myself from the memories of those I loved. But life, I learned, has a more generous way of preserving our significance. It does so quietly, through presence that is not constant, through love that is steady yet unobtrusive, through lessons taught not by words, but by the life one lives. I discovered that my grandchildren remembered me in ways that didn't require grand gestures or forced appearances. The afternoons we had spent baking, the quiet evenings listening to them read, the laughter that spilled over when I told them stories from long ago. These were the threads that wove me into the fabric of their lives. Even when I was absent from a party or a photograph, those threads remained intact. And I understood that significance cannot be measured by invitations received, but by the depth of connection that endures beyond fleeting ceremonies. I began to embrace the rhythm of my life as it was now, less about obligation, more about choice, less about proving my worth, more about embodying it. The anger and disappointment that had once felt like anchors around my chest were now memories I could revisit without being dragged under. They were teachers in disguise, showing me the limits of control and the resilience of patience. I let go of the resentment that had simmered quietly, choosing instead to cultivate quiet pride in the life I had lived, in the boundaries I had finally dared to draw. I realized that stepping back did not diminish my value, it revealed it. By allowing others to carry their responsibilities, I had opened space for them to grow, and in doing so, I had grown myself. My family began to interact with me differently, not out of fear or expectation, but from a place of genuine affection and respect. Conversations became lighter, laughter more effortless, and the rare moments of tension were brief, dissolved quickly by mutual understanding rather than my intervention. I found joy in observing my grandchildren flourish, knowing that my guidance had taken root in them even when I wasn't directly involved. In these small victories, I found a deeper satisfaction than any party, any cake, any birthday song could have given me. Life, I understood, does not require dramatics to be meaningful. It is the quiet persistence of love, the steadfastness of one's character, and the patience to witness the unfolding of those we care for without clutching at every moment that leave the most enduring marks. Sitting alone one evening, I watched the sun set, warm light spilling across the floor, and I smiled. Not because everything had gone perfectly, but because it had gone honestly. I had survived disappointment, I had survived absence, and I had found peace. And in that peace, I finally understood that the measure of a grandparent is not in the parties they attend, but in the love that endures silently, persistently, beyond the noise and the oversight. Life had taught me, gently but firmly, that absence does not erase presence, and that love, when rooted deeply enough, does not need constant validation. That realization, quiet as it was, carried the most profound lesson. We matter not for the events we attend, but for the heart we leave behind. And with that lesson held close, I felt a serenity I had never known before, a deep certainty that my place in my family was secure, not in appearances, but in essence, in the enduring, unshakable love that threads us all together, even when the world seems to overlook it.